You're on. You're up. Well, good morning, everybody. Making the switch from the government to a job I really got to work at, so I can sympathize with y'all for all your efforts. It's been interesting. Please forgive me as I go through the speech and I say "we," referring to OSHA. Man, that's been the hardest habit for me to break. So if I say "we," I mean OSHA up front. Here today, talk a little bit about global harmonization, the modifications OSHA made to the standard, roughly about a year ago or so. Like everybody knows, the first implementation date's coming up on December 13th when y'all have to have a training program or your employees retrained in the new system. So at the end of the presentation, I put together a sample employee training program you guys can take back and make site specific. I'll leave it with the association here in case you guys want a copy, or I can email it to you. Got some business cards up here if you want a copy, so we'll be glad to give you a copy of the presentation after. This is really more of a train-the-trainer session for GHS, get you guys kind of up to speed in case you get those difficult questions as you guys go back and try to train your own folks. Come on. This is working just a minute ago. Oh, well. Plan for the day, we're going to really take an overlook of the GHS, what the GHS system is, how it's implemented, and that kind of thing. Talk about the benefits as OSHA goes through and promulgates the standard. They have to go ahead and do a cost-benefit analysis, and we'll show you some of the data on that. Overview some of the major changes or highlight some of the changes, and then really go through in detail, paragraph by paragraph of the standard and show you how it changed there. And then finally, like I said, we have an employee training program example. Probably won't go all the way through that in an hour and a half, but again, that's available for you. And then there's also some reference materials. There's some links to some reference materials out there in terms of the international GHS system, OSHA's hazard communication webpage. I've also highlighted, I think there was 5 brand new publications just put out by OSHA, and I'll show you through those some quick cards, which could also be very valuable to you folks as you go through the training. Oops. What is the GHS? It's an international system where they go through and basically classify chemicals, and then based upon that classification to prescribe certain labeling and safety data sheet information that has to be brought forward. Oh, gosh darn it. It's a United Nations system. It's published every 2 years in what's called the GHS Purple Book. It's a United Nations publication. The standard, the revisions to the OSHA standard are based upon the 2009 edition of the International GHS Purple Book. A copy of that Purple Book is either available at the United Nations website, and I've got the link later, or if you go to OSHA's Hazard Communication page, they have the 2009 copy of the GHS book there for you guys to download. It's already, GHS is being used pretty much in Europe right now, currently, and also in the Asian Pacific Rim. Countries such as Japan, France, Italy, all those types of places have already transitioned over, and they have implemented the GHS. Just yesterday, I got an email saying OSHA's been working with Canada to try to make the Canadian GHS or HAZCOM standard consistent with the United States, and the information I got yesterday indicates that we were successful at that, and basically Canada now has agreed to adopt the system that we've developed here in the United States. So if you guys trade across borders or receive chemicals across borders, it should be real good. GHS, what it is not is it's not an international standard. It's a set of guidelines, okay? Each country can go out there, and when they adopt the GHS into their country system, they're able to use that system as a building block. Each country is allowed to modify that, tweak it a little bit based upon the needs of that particular country. And I'll show you in several instances where OSHA's exercised that option and made some modifications to what you'll actually find in the GHS Purple Book. The real reason for GHS initially was to, globalize or to make consistent on an international basis the requirements for safety data sheets. That's really helpful, especially for companies who trade chemicals internationally. They might have had to develop 10 different material safety data sheets when they're sending chemicals to different countries. What this should do for them is make one safety data sheet that's now recognized worldwide, or one classification system for the chemicals to be used nationwide. Yep. Again, the biggest change in the way that the GHS system works has to do with the way that the hazards are actually classified, what the hazards are, both the physical hazards and the health hazards and carcinogenicity, for instance. That should all be standard across all the countries that use the system. Based upon that classification of the chemicals, again, it standardizes what the content of a safety data sheet and the labels for the containers are. I'll show you appendices A and B. For Appendix A, the new standard is for health hazards, how to classify them. Appendix B is how to classify a chemical based upon the physical hazards. Based upon the information that you gather, or the categorization that it leads you to based upon the information on that chemical, you then go to Appendices C, and it tells you exactly what the labeling requirements are, what the safety data sheet contents should be, and all that, and we'll show you how that plays out. Again, it's a building block approach, not a prescriptive standard. OSHA's exercised. They identified a couple of holes in the system with the international GHS system, and we've basically made 4 major modifications to the standard to reflect those holes in the international system. The scope of the standard has not changed whatsoever. It really just covers chemical hazards. Still not covered are radiological hazards that are posed by chemicals, biological agents, hazardous waste, all the things that were exempted under the old standard. Consumer products, for instance, still remain exempted underneath the new system, so you don't have to go back and search for data on WD-40 or something that's, for instance, a consumer product. Back in 1983 is when OSHA originally published the Hazard Communications Standard. If you go back and look at the preamble to that 1983 standard, it actually, at that time, recognized the international GHS system. And there's a statement in the preamble that 1910-1200 would have to be modified in the future to incorporate the GHS system. So it really should come as no surprise to any of us that OSHA actually did go back and do that. We actually supported the adoption of it, and we actually chaired the International GHS Committee at the United Nations level, so we've had a lot of input in it, into the system, even at the international level. God darn it. All right, rulemaking history. First time that we heard that we're going to modify the Hazard Communications Standard was back in September of 2006 when OSHA published what's called an Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Basically said, hey, we're interested in modifying the Hazard Communications Standard to incorporate GHS. Does anybody have any experiences with GHS? Please provide us some information so we can consider that as we're going through the rulemaking or development of the new rule. Then after that, in September of 2009, is the first time we saw what's called an Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or proposed rulemaking. And that's the first time we were able to see some regulatory text of the standard. And more importantly, it's the first time they printed the preamble kind of explaining, okay, here's the changes, here's why we're incorporating the changes, here's what the changes mean. So if you have any questions about the standard as you're reading through it, it's always good to go back and look at those preambles because they give you a much more robust explanation of really what the actual regulatory language means. Acronym for the new modified standard is HAZCOM 2012. Every government organization has to have their acronym, so that's the way that folks internally at OSHA refer to it. Oh, did I go back? There we go. After we put forth that notice of proposed rulemaking. It established a 90-day period for some written comments. Subsequent to that, we held some public hearings. I think they were in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., as I remember, or Pittsburgh and Washington. After that, where they could actually go up before a magistrate, submit briefs, testify about experiences, both pro and con, about the system. As subsequent to that, then, there was an open time where they could submit post-hearing briefs in writing, either supporting or not supporting the standard. All that information we gained, OSHA gained through all those rulemaking procedures was considered, and that's the basis for how they developed the final rule. The final rule was then finally published in the Federal Register in March of 2012 with a 60-day effective date. So the standard actually became effective on May 25th of 2012. But however, even though it was effective, none of the provisions really changed, or none of the implementation dates have come up yet, with the exception, the first one being the December for training of this year. You wonder why OSHA has problems promulgating a standard, why it takes so long. OSHA actually has the most complicated rule-making set of procedures and regulations governing the operation. It's a multi-step process, so OSHA getting a standard out in 8 years is pretty much lightning speed. So, why adopt the GHS? I mean, OSHA's original intent is to further reduce injuries and illnesses in the workplace. I mean, that's the bottom line of it. Interesting part of it is since the time that the standard was originally published in 1983, there was a 42% reduction in chemical source related injuries and illnesses and fatalities over that time. So again, kind of proof that original standard was pretty effective. But again, we realize that there's a critical need for further reductions in those injuries or those illnesses related to handling chemicals. So we modified the standard, or they modified the standard. How many we's have I done already? Wow. So again, one of the shortcomings of the old standard, just because of the way that the chemicals were evaluated under the old standard, a lot of times the material safety data sheets and the labeling information didn't really adequately describe the long-term or chronic effects of the chemicals that were out there, and this particular modification of the standard will go a long way to doing that. One of the other reasons OSHA modified the standard was for increased comprehensibility. With the changing demographics of the United States, a lot of, for instance, Spanish-speaking folks come in the United States, not literate in English, or low literacy folks, for instance, who might be Native Americans, have a hard time getting to information about the chemicals or what the hazards are. What we believe, or what OSHA believes under the new standard, is that this should increase comprehensibility because of alternate ways, or specifically the pictograms that are associated with the labels and material safety data sheets, that even someone who cannot read or write, for instance, should be able to take a look at the chemical, and based upon that pictogram, at least get some degree of understanding about the hazards associated with that chemical. It also standardizes the information. Underneath the old standard, there was no prescribed format, for instance, for material safety data sheets. It just was up to the developer of that safety data sheet what format, what information was to be contained on that. All that is standardized. The information flow out of this process has been standardized. So, for instance, two people evaluating the same chemical at two different companies should come to the same conclusions, same hazard warnings, same safety data sheets should result from two different sources characterizing that chemical. This should help facilitate your training, especially again in low literacy populations. One of the good things about it, by standardizing the format of the safety data sheet, let's say, for instance, we do have a chemical related incident, somebody gets an exposure to it, or you have a fire or a spill or whatever, you know that you can immediately pick up the safety data sheet and you can go to sections 4, 5, and 6, and that's all your emergency response information. Rather than under the old system with no standardized format, you'd have to read the entire safety data sheet under an emergency situation to really get to the critical information that you need. So this should be especially helpful, again, during emergency response types of operations. There should be a large cost savings to the American businesses. The standardized format, kind of the cookbook approach, should result in less time developing safety data sheets, should result in less time for you guys doing HAZCOM training. You don't have to go through your chemical inventory, identify every hazard of a chemical, and then train upon that. If you just train upon the physical hazard and the health hazard categories under the new system, that takes care of your having to go back and compile what the hazards of every chemical that you guys specifically handle in your workplace. So that should save you a lot of time with your training efforts. Again, the cost-benefit analysis in the preamble, if you go through it, we estimate that this is going to affect about 5 million workplaces out there, about 43 million workers per year exposed to some type of chemical in the workplace out there. They're talking about annual savings from implementing a new rule ranging between, say, $600 to $800 million per year. Pretty significant. Keep us as the United States competitive in the world marketplace, those types of things. More importantly, the cost-benefit analysis revealed that it should be about 500 or more than 500 less injuries and illnesses and about 43 less fatalities per year by going to the new system. Let me remind you that the penalties for non-compliance are real. Everybody knows kind of the bent of the new agency being pretty heavy-handed on enforcement. I did see a copy of a draft directive on the new hazard communication standard or the revised hazard communication standard before I left the agency. One of the tricks that they were instructing each compliance officer to do while they're doing an inspection is to come into your facility and say, okay, what kind of employee turnover do you have? Okay, establish you guys have turnover. Then the next question is, can you give me a list of the 5 employees that you most recently hired? Okay, based upon that list that they get, they're going to go out and interview those 5 most current employees to determine if they've been trained in HAZCOM, okay? Because if you read the HAZCOM standard, the training requirements say prior to initial placement in work involving exposure to a chemical, you have to be trained. So again, they're going to use that to make sure everybody's trained almost on the first day that they come into your operation. So be aware of that. One of the other things that happened is in the prior administrations, in the Republican administrations, they issued what's called the Paperwork Reductions Directive for the enforcement folks in OSHA. And under that old policy, it basically said if you go out and find a paperwork violation, let's say you don't have a material safety data sheet, or if you don't have a written program, for instance, that would have to be issued as an other than serious violation with no penalty. The problem was, at the same time, the OSHA performance metrics on the individual compliance officer were expecting about 90% serious violations. So that created a huge disincentive that none of the compliance officers were citing hazard communication. And as a result, after implementation of the directive, the HAZCOM violations fell out of the top 10 nationally, okay? This administration came back in, kind of modified that paperwork violations directive and allows the compliance officers now to cite serious violations for lack of a material safety data sheet, lack of a written program. The paperwork type violations allows them to cite those as serious violations. As a result, hazard communication has come back up now into the top 10 of all violations nationwide. So again, they are doing a little bit heavier-handed enforcement out there. Last time I checked, it was number 3 out of the top 10 violations, again, because it's allowed to be cited serious and penalized, and doesn't reflect badly upon the individual compliance officer's performance metrics. Major changes to the standard. Any questions about the background or how we got there? Anybody ever like they're giving a speech at the United Nations and the headphones aren't working? You guys are kind of quiet. All right. Go on. Some of the major changes to the standard, like I said, the key change to the standard is the way that we classify chemicals. There are specific criteria. You go out there and you gather all the toxicological information, the physical data about that chemical. You plug that into either Appendix A and B, and it comes out and tells you exactly which class. Based upon what class and hazard category it comes out into, you then go to Appendix C. Appendix C tells you, okay, here's the hazard warnings, here's the pictogram that's to be applied. So again, it's pretty much a cookbook approach to it. It takes away the old evaluate the chemical language in the old standard. And in this one it says, you know, based upon these specific criteria, classify the chemicals in accordance with the GHS system. Again, based upon that categorization, based upon Appendices A and B, you go to Appendix C, and that's where it tells you exactly what labeling information should be out there. New terms or new concepts on the labels include things like signal word and pictograms and hazard statements. All that kind of stuff is going to be brought forward onto the new label. The safety data sheets, again, have been standardized into a new 16-section format. If you go to Appendix D in the standard, it tells you what has to be included in each one of the 16 sections of that safety data sheet. That 16 sections has to appear on the data sheet in that order. So again, for instance, in case of emergency response, you always know that sections 4, 5, and 6 are where you need to go. Again, information and training, we have to train all of our workers up by December 1st. It seems to me, I mean, a lot of folks have commented, it doesn't seem like we have the cart before the horse, because we're training workers prior to requiring the manufacturers to actually label and provide the safety data sheets in the new format. OSHA's thought on that is we see a lot of chemicals coming into the country, for instance, from Europe already, that have the SDS new format. The labels are in accordance with the new GHS criteria. It'd be good to give that information out to the workers prior to them seeing a lot of those chemicals are coming in, or the new paperwork changes that are due. So that's why employee training was the first target date under the standard. We've modified the provisions that have to be changed. Basic framework of the standard really hasn't changed. I mean, it's still the duty of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or distributor to develop the information, disseminate that downstream to the end chemical users. You guys as end chemical users are under the same obligations to have your written program, your chemical inventory, and do the training for your employees. So the overall framework of the standard really hasn't changed. The hardest part of this is going to be people that actually manufacture, import, or distribute these chemicals to get all their information up to speed with the new GHS provisions. During the rulemaking, OSHA wanted to make sure that at least the same level of protection as the old standard remained in effect, but again, they believe that it's going to enhance the level of protection pretty significantly. Again, the OSHA tried to make minimal modifications to the terminology, but there were some required modifications of terminology just to make it GHS consistent. The scope and application of the standard remains the same. For instance, hazardous waste, consumer products, all that kind of stuff, regulated pesticides, those types of things where a different agency has jurisdiction over it still remain outside the scope of the standard. The written hazard communication programs, workers training, and trade secret provisions of the old standard are pretty much, there's some minor word tweaking here and there, but the overall framework is the same as you guys are used to. Again, some of the other aspects of the approach that we wanted to assure was consistency with our major training partners. One of the unforeseen side effects of this is OSHA realized that they had to go back and modify some of the other standards that had information about chemicals in them. Most importantly, for instance, if you guys are in general industry, if you take a look at 1910-106, handling flammable materials, 107, spray finishing operations, have had to change significantly, and really that's based upon revisions of the definition of what a flammable liquid is, and I'll show you some details on that. One of the other major standards that you guys might get into, let's say you go to are doing some construction work at a chemical processing facility, it's affected coverage under the process safety management standard also based upon the redefinition of what a flammable liquid is. Organization of the final rule. Again, OSHA tried to maintain the bulk of the language and the actual text of the standard the same as it was, made as few modifications to that as possible. All the real modifications to the standard, again, come by incorporating the major changes of the way you classify and label and safety data sheet requirements are back in the appendices. So the real meat of the changes are found in the new appendices A through F. Appendices A and B are, a real booger to read, especially when you get into like mixtures of chemicals. In appendices A, I mean, they got all these wonderful algebraic equations and all this kind of stuff. But you guys, as end users of chemical mainly, really don't have to worry a lot about appendices A and B or understanding every detail of the appendices A and B about classification, because if you guys don't have to classify, as long as you're familiar with it or how it's classified, you guys don't have to sit there and agonize over these mixture formulas and all that kind of stuff that are in the appendices. From your standpoint, probably the most important thing as an end user is to take a look at appendices C on labeling criteria, hazard warning statements, precautionary statements, all that kind of stuff, pictograms. Make sure you understand that. And then appendices D is a good read because it tells you exactly what should be in each one of the 16 sections of the safety data sheet. So again, don't agonize as you guys actually read the standard about understanding word for word what appendices A and B are. Organization of the final rule, exactly as it was under the 1983 version of the Hazard Communication Standard. The major changes to the standard are highlighted in the colored sections, so we'll go through and we'll discuss those in detail. Here's a look at, again, what the appendices are. Appendix A is a mandatory new appendix that tells you how to classify a chemical based upon the health hazards. Similarly, Appendix B is a new appendix that tells you how to classify a chemical based upon the physical hazards, fire, flammability, reactivity, those types of things. Appendix C, once you gather your information again in classifying in accordance with Appendix A and B, it'll tell you what hazard category and class that it's in, or class and category. Based upon that information, you go to Appendix C, and it's going to tell you exactly what the information needs to be on the safety data sheets and labeling systems. Appendix E, they've tweaked the definition of trade secret in a minor way. Basically the same as the old system. You guys, as safety and health professionals or treating physician in an emergency, has a right to get access to that trade secret confidential information. Procedures remain the same, and let's say that company won't give you information about the exact chemical composition. You guys need to do air sampling. If they won't work with you, give you that information, give the OSHA office a call. We'll usually handle that by phone and fax that manufacturer saying, hey, give it up to our safety professionals for reasons of need to assess the workplace. The only non-mandatory appendix is Appendix F. It has to do with how to classify chemical based upon carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, teratogenicity, those types of things. All right, any questions up to that point? Good. Earphones, come on, everybody, check their earphones, come on. All right, side-by-side comparison. This is actually one of the things that's out on the OSHA Hazard Communication homepage. It actually takes the regulatory text of the old standard and regulatory text of the new standard, blocks out the old stuff, and shows you in highlighted format what's under the new standard. And that's kind of how I developed these slides. So if you want to read exactly what the regulatory changes are, great document out on the Hazard Communication homepage. All right, going to paragraph A of the standard. Again, major change really. It has to do with how under the old standard chemicals were evaluated for the hazards. No guidance, no criteria. It was a performance-oriented standard, kind of the first of that generation of standards that OSHA tried to put out. Again, this is a major change of the standard. Now they are to be classified in accordance with the criteria that you'll find in the appendices. And again, all of the criteria, all the labeling requirements are based upon the 2009 version of the GHS Purple Book. We had to make some minor clarification of the language regarding federalism. They did that by going ahead and again, the highlighted text basically said that an individual state cannot go out there and specify that a material safety data sheet or a labeling system that's different from the federal. We federalized it, so if you do business in the United States, the hazard communication standard is going to be the same in all 50 states, including all the state plan operated states. So for instance, California or some of those other kind of left type states can't modify the standard, require different format, different content, different classifications of chemicals. All right, any questions on the scope? Again, it doesn't cover FIFRA chemicals, hazardous waste, consumer products, all those exemptions, biological agents, radiological properties of the chemicals are still not covered. Scope and application, really minimal changes were made to that paragraph. Really, the changes that were made reflect changes in terminology between the old system and the new GHS system. It removed reference to an old Appendix E. All the appendices under the old standard were deleted and replaced with all those new meaty type of appendices under the new system. Under definitions, we went back and again to make a GHS consistent, went ahead and physical hazards definition had been removed. Several different other terms in the definition section were removed. Most importantly, probably flashpoint, hazard warning, material safety data sheet. No longer are they called MSDSs, they're called SDSs, right? That sound like something you got in college, SDS? Anyway, again, really the changes in the appendices were really made for definitional purposes. Taking a look at a couple of those, some of the terms no longer being used again are hazard warning, identity, material safety data sheets. Several terms had to be modified. They're still there, but they've been modified. Those include chemical name, hazardous chemical, health hazard, label, mixture, physical hazard, and trade secret. Those have had some minor text modifications. Several terms were added to the text of the new regulation to reflect the GHS terminology. Some of the new terms, or some of the more important terms, are classification. Again, that's basically how you identify the both physical and health hazards based upon the appendices. Hazard class, that's the first new important term under the standard. That basically describes the nature of either the physical and or health hazards that are posed by that chemical they're putting into certain hazard classes. Underneath of a hazard class, you can have something that's called a hazard category. What a hazard category does underneath that hazard class is give you a degree of relative dangerousness or hazard associated with that particular chemical within that hazard class. Hazard statement, and again, this is a statement that comes out of Appendices C that's assigned to chemical based upon its hazard category and hazard class, and I'll show you examples of that here in a minute. It added the term pictogram. That's basically a graphical representation of what hazard class the chemical falls into. Precautionary statements, those are things that tell you what the bad effect could be, or what measures should be taken, rather, regarding handling that particular chemical. Safety data sheets, again, have replaced MSDS. And then finally, signal word, that's just a one-word phrase that indicates the relative level of hazard for that particular chemical. Definition of a hazardous chemical has been changed, and it's any chemical which has been classified as a physical hazard or health hazard. That's the GHS definition. Okay, OSHA added to the definition a simple asphyxiant, a combustible dust, a pyrophoric gas, or a hazard not elsewhere classified. That's the first place where OSHA's deviated again from the GHS based upon our evaluation of the GHS system. It didn't adequately address asphyxiation hazards, combustible dusts, pyrophoric gases. And then the hazard not elsewhere classified category is something that OSHA put into the standard so that they didn't have to go back. Let's say we get a new chemical with a new and emerging hazard, for instance. Use nanoparticles, for instance. Hazards of that really aren't known. It really doesn't fit any of the GHS criteria. So this allows a placeholder so that if we find a new emerging hazard, a new type of a situation posed by a chemical, OSHA doesn't have to go back and modify the standard in order for that information to be brought forward. Again, that was done under that building block approach. Again, GHS is not a standard, it's a guideline that you use as a building block. So again, that's where we added those different chemical hazards. Hazards not elsewhere classified. We talked about that. That's the placeholder, so it doesn't have to keep modifying the standard. Some examples of things that might be important on a material safety data sheet to be reported as a hazard not elsewhere classified is, let's say, something that's highly magnetic, okay? That would probably be good information to have if you're a chip manufacturer, a Silicon Chip Valley manufacturer, for instance. Probably the place where it's going to be used the most, though, is underneath the old hazard communication standard. Remember, for physical and health hazards, you didn't have to report the hazards of that chemical if it was present in your mixture less than 1%. Okay, under the new standard, we said, okay, we're still putting that cutoff at 1%, but let's say you have a chemical that's so incredibly toxic that it could have a toxic effect at less than 1% concentration. Give you an example, use plutonium. Not based upon the radiological hazard, but plutonium metal itself is incredibly toxic. So let's say you had a mixture of chemicals where plutonium was present in that mixture at less than 1%. It would still be incredibly toxic to somebody if they got in there. So since it falls below the 1%, you don't classify it in accordance with appendices A and B. You'd report it as a hazard not elsewhere classified because it falls below the concentration of that 1% arbitrary cutoff for mixtures of chemicals. All right, any questions on that? All right, hazard classification. Again, under the old standard, it was all performance evaluated. The language is the old standard is you evaluate the chemicals and report the results of your evaluation. It doesn't tell you to evaluate physical hazards, health hazards, carcinogenicity. It just kind of left it out there in performance language type of thing. So under the new standard, that evaluation has been changed to classify it in accordance with, again, specific criteria that you find in the appendices. Under the old standard, there was a floor of chemicals that said any chemical regulated by OSHA in Table Z 1910-1000 or the construction standards 1955 had to be included. That language was taken out because the people that wrote the standard looked at the OSHA regulated chemicals and they fit the GHS system, so the floor of chemicals was no longer needed in there. For mixtures, again, the old standard just said evaluate the mixture. Underneath this new standard, the most complex part of the standard, if you're a manufacturer, importer, or distributor, is that classification of a mixture. And there are specific rules that are in appendices A and B to do that. Okay, once you go ahead and do your hazard classification, each physical or health hazard is then put into a hazard class. Examples of that are, on physical side might be a flammable liquid or a reactive chemical. On the health hazard side of it, it might be something that's a neurotoxin, a carcinogen, those types of things. So each of those hazard classes is identified through the appendices by just putting in your raw data about your chemical that your literature search reveals. Based upon that, you go to appendices A and B, and it tells you again what hazard class to put it in, and then based upon, for instance, the dose that it takes to get somebody sick, that's further perhaps subdivided into hazard categories, subcategories underneath the hazard class, which indicate the relative hazard of that chemical within that hazard class. So again, by looking at both the hazard class and the hazard categories, you not only know what the hazard is, but you know relatively how dangerous that chemical is with it, to present that unwanted hazard. Just kind of graphically, your hazard classification system results in your hazard class, which tells you the hazard type. And then finally, a hazard class can, or sometimes is not, broken down into hazard categories, which tell you the severity of that hazard. Okay, out of the GHS Purple Book, here's an actual, listing of the 16 categories of physical hazard, and then there's 10 categories of health hazards underneath the GHS system. So again, from a training standpoint, if you train your employees on these categories, hazard classes, your hazard communications standard, training's done. You don't have to go back, look at every SDS, get every hazard, write that down, make sure you train on it. Under the GHS system, there's also a set of environmental hazard classes. OSHA is not enforcing that at all. That's EPA, DOT, those types of agencies are under development of rules of what they want in the environmental classes and then how those are to be reported on the new safety data sheets. And there's a link to their websites later on if you guys want to see what's going on with DOT or EPA, for instance. Here's what OSHA did. Again, remember the building block approach as we went through and we evaluated all the chemicals that we could think of, and identified that there were 2 physical hazards that weren't adequately covered in the Purple Book by the Purple Book GHS system. That's pyrophoric gases and combustible dust. So based upon that building block approach, OSHA added those as new hazard classes for physical hazards. Similarly, for health hazards, went through, evaluated, and saw a hole in the GHS system for simple asphyxiants. So again, OSHA added simple asphyxiant as a health hazard class underneath the standard. And then finally, they added a whole new class of hazards not elsewhere classified, that placeholder type of thing for those undefined or undiscovered types of hazards that are out there, or hazards associated with chemicals that are present at less than 1% concentration. Again, it's the manufacturers who are still responsible for doing all of that hazard classification. Okay, so if you guys are out there actually creating a new chemical in your workplace or not a manufacturer, again, you don't have to take a look at it. What the standard says is the manufacturers have to go out there and do basically a literature search and consider the full range of available information. So they're going to have to go out there and search chemical abstract services and Google it and do all the big literature searches to identify everything about that chemical, compile all that data, and then take it and compare it to the criteria in appendices A and B to determine what hazard class and hazard category that it goes into. Again, for carcinogens, what it says is if there's a single positive study, if for carcinogenicity, teratogenicity, or mutagenicity, that has to be reported on the safety data sheet. So you might see a lot more chemicals having a carcinogen warning based upon this new system. If you take a look at the hazard classes, here's the first time you kind of have a graphical portrayal of hazard categories underneath each one of the hazard classes. One of the things where OSHA removed a criteria under the Purple Book, where we differ from the international system, has to do with acute toxicity. Under the GHS system, there is a Category 5 for acute toxicity. OSHA removed Category 5 reporting requirements because if you take a look at the dose for those chemicals that fall into Category 5, it was so large that you basically had to eat your body weight in the chemical in order to get a toxic effect. So OSHA took out Category 5. However, if you get chemicals from overseas, it might show Category 5. So again, be aware of that. Again, for simple asphyxiants, OSHA added a single category for simple asphyxiants. As you can see, respiratory or skin sensitizers, there's only one class. Things such as, let's say, reproductive toxicity, there's several, or acute toxicity, several categories. One of the first things that you guys need to emphasize in training is the most hazardous chemical within a hazard class is a Category 1. Can anybody see some problems with that right now? Anybody using NFPA 704 for implant labeling? What's the most hazardous category in 704? So guess what, guys? Your systems are backwards if you're using 704 for implant labeling, and it's going to be critical that you guys train your folks up on that difference, the backwards numbering between 704 and the GHS system. Here's an example again. Let's say we do our exhaustive literature search, and we find that our chemical 2,4-dimethyl no good for you has a lethal dose of, say, let's 25 milligrams per kilogram. LD50 is where 50% of the population will die from exposure to that. We go through our literature search and we find out, okay, the LD50 for this chemical is 25 milligrams per kilogram. We go to appendices A and we say, okay, it's an acute toxin with an LD of 25, so that's going to put us in hazard category 2. So again, that's how it's a cookbook, a specification approach, takes all that evaluated language out of the system. So again, that's kind of how Appendice A works. You just gather your data, compare it to the tables, and it tells you what hazard category and class that chemical falls into. Going one step further, again, going back to our example of 25 milligrams per kilogram is category 2, then we go to Appendix C, and Appendix C is going to tell you exactly what pictogram and what signal word. Let me show the pictogram prescribed to that is the skull and crossbones, the signal word prescribed to that is danger, and the precautionary statement on that is fatal if swallowed. So again, that's the information that needs to be brought forward onto both your label and your safety data sheet in Section 2. Here's some classification criteria, again, just some tables out of the Appendice A. It breaks it down into acute oral toxicity is what we were looking back, but oral doses, dermal, gases, vapors, dusts, based upon the permissible exposure limits, those types of things. It tells you exactly what category to put those things in from a health hazard out of Appendix A standpoint. All right, one of the hazard communications definition, basically what happened is DOT years ago knew that the GHS system was out there, and they made modifications to their standard years and years ago. So if you take a look at a lot of the definitions of the physical hazard that are under the GHS and under the OSHA system, they are absolutely consistent with the 49 CFR definitions for transportation, with one exception, and that has to do with the definitions of corrosiveness. Under the 9 CFR, all you got to do is, shave the little bunny rabbit, smear the stuff on there, and leave it on there for 4 hours and see if it develops some kind of a skin burn or whatever. Underneath the new criteria, basically the same test, except you have to leave that material in residence with the bunny skin for 14 days rather than 4 hours to see if it does it. So that's the only difference of definitions from physical hazards that we deviate from the DOT requirements. Okay, carcinogens. What the Appendice F basically says, the non-mandatory Appendice F says, is if you go out there and you look at the IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Carcinogenicity, or if you go out and look at the National Toxicology Program, the NTP database, if they say it's a carcinogen, you can report it. That's kind of like a floor of carcinogen. However, if you go out there and you're doing your exhaustive literature search and you do come up with a single positive study on carcinogenicity, as long as that study was good science, statistically reliable results, those type of things, you still have to report a single positive finding that's scientifically valid and statistically valid. Okay, going on to physical hazards. Here's how the physical hazards categories and classes break down. We did add pyrophoric gases. single category, and combustible dusts are added as a single category. Flammable liquids, for instance, have several different things, self-reactive, again, out to type G types of things. So that's just kind of the lay of how it looks in terms of classes and categories for your physical hazards, which are the result of comparing your data to Appendix B for physical hazards. One of the biggest changes is kind of represented by this in terms of physical hazards. If you take a look at the definition of a flammable liquid, is anything with a flash point less than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? Underneath the new criteria, basically flammable liquids are in the OSHA system or anything with a flash point below 73 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? So this is another thing you guys might want to cover in your training sessions, is any chemical that falls with a flash point between 73 and 100 used to be flammable. Now they're going to see that same barrel coming in. Let's say it has a flash point of 88 degrees. It could come in. It's no longer going to have that flammable liquid sticker on it, okay? So this is maybe one of the other things you might want to mention in your training sessions if employees ask why all of a sudden it went from flammable to non-flammable. Again, some of the significant decisions that OSHA had to make was, okay, now we've added these new categories of pyrophoric gas, simple asphyxiant, and combustible dust, but you go to Appendix C and it doesn't tell you what the pictogram is, all that kind of stuff. So OSHA had a lot of modifications to the GHS system and then Appendix C for pyrophoric gases, asphyxiants, and dust. So, for instance, OSHA has told you that the signal word, for instance, for a pyrophoric gas is danger. The hazard statement, because again it's not in the appendice, is catches fire spontaneously if exposed to air, and we do use the flammable liquids pictogram for that. For instance, that's simple asphyxiant is going to have a signal word of warning, may displace oxygen. But again, cover this in your training. There's going to be no pictogram on there. So if you have somebody who's low literacy, doesn't read it, and is relying upon a pictogram, it could still be something that's a simple asphyxiant, and it's not going to be labeled with a pictogram if they're solely relying upon pictograms. Similarly, for combustible dusts, signal words warning, may foreign combustible dust concentrations, and again, it could present that hazard, but there's no pictogram for combustible dust. So again, cover that in your training if you guys are in that situation so that they don't learn to just solely rely upon those pictograms. Again, one of the unique aspects was the addition of that hazards not elsewhere classified. Again, that was just done as we thought initially about putting combustible dust in that category, but we decided to put it under physical hazards category, or class rather. Nanomaterials. Anybody see NIOSH finally came out yet? Was it earlier this week? I think Monday, for carbon nanotubes. I don't know if you guys get into any of that kind of stuff, but they've finally put out a recommended exposure limit of 1 microgram per cubic meter, really, really low, a lot of toxic effects. So again, normally that would have fallen under, maybe a nuisance dust, okay, wouldn't have to really been reported. So nanomaterials might be an example of something where it would be reported as a hazard not elsewhere classified. Again, what HNOC is, it has some type of either a physical or a health hazard associated with it that just doesn't happen to meet the criteria in appendices A and B, okay? There's, again, holes in there, new emerging hazards, those types of things. So, again, where we expect to see that probably exercised most often is if it could be toxic at less than 1% presence in a mixture. So, if it is an HNOC, the only place you're going to find the information that it falls in that HNOC category is on Section 2 of the safety data sheet, okay? So there's going to be no labeling requirements for an HNOC, so that's another hole in the system where you have low literacy workers relying upon pictograms. It could be an HNOC chemical, and it's not going to have a pictogram associated with it. So again, recommend you address those types of issues in your workers, in your training program if you have those types of chemicals. Simple asphyxiant, again, that's something that just displaces air, and we showed the graphic earlier where we had to, assign a hazard warning statement, a signal word, all those types of things. Likewise, same thing for pyrophoric gas. Excuse me. And pyrophoric gas is, anything that in a gaseous state will ignite if it's exposed to air. Combustible dust, again, we decided in the earlier proposals to cover that as an HNOC hazard, not elsewhere classified, but we decided to put that on its own physical hazard class. One of the problems is there is absolutely no definition of what a combustible dust is under the new GHS system, okay? My recommendation to you guys is go out and look at the NFPA, was it 680 series or something in that area of NFPA standards that talk about combustible organic dust, combustible metals, all those types of things. There's a series of NFPA standards out there, and use the definitions out of that would be my best advice for you on that. If you do find something that's combustible dust, again, there's the signal words warning, and the hazard statements may form combustible concentrations. The original paragraph 1200F4 is still in effect, so let's say you guys are out on a construction site, you got a 2x4, and now you're sawing a 2x4. Guess what? You guys just became a chemical manufacturer because you've created a combustible dust. So again, when you get your, for instance, 2x4s or something like that, make sure you're getting a safety data sheet for them for the combustible dust hazard. Most complicated part of the standard. Basically, the standard allows you to approach mixers or evaluate mixtures one of three ways, okay? The first option is to go out there and take your mixture and submit it for toxicology testing, explosibility testing, measure the vapor density, all that kind of stuff. Basically generate your own data on that, okay? Put it on the bunny skin for 14 days and see what happens. I mean, all of those kind of tests, all right? Standard does not require a chemical manufacturer, importer, or distributor to do that. It allows them the option to do that if they want to test the mixture as a whole, but it does not require that. The second option that it allows the standard on how to classify mixtures is to go out there and do your literature search, and let's say you come up with a toxicology study that says, okay, a 50% mixture of 2,4-dimethyl no good for you has this toxic effect, okay? But you look at it and you say, okay, concentration of our of 2,4-dimethyl no good for you in our preparation is only 25%, okay? What this allows you to do, this second option, is to go out there and use what are called epidemiological bridging principles, and there's a whole bunch of them described in the appendices. Kind of take a swag. Everybody know what a swag is? A scientific wild-ass guess. You take a guess at really what the difference between toxicity in a 50% solution versus your 25% solution is, and report that based upon your literature study. The third option is you can go out there and let's say you're just a chemical formulator, okay? From DuPont you get toluene, from American cyanamide you get methyl alcohol, for instance. And what the third approach allows you to do is, let's say you're just a little chemical preparation manufacturer, you're not really making the chemicals, but you have the material safety data sheets and all your raw products that you're putting into the mixture. It allows you to go out there and take the material safety data sheet for your toluene and the material safety data sheet for your methanol, bring forward onto your material safety data sheet for the mixture all the hazards that are reported on the individual components safety data sheets, okay? So that's probably where we'll see most of the mixture safety data sheets developed, is just based upon the safety data sheets for the individual components that are compiled onto your single mixture data sheet. Again, standard still maintains the minimum concentration cutoffs for mixtures. Again, if it's not a carcinogen, teratogen, or mutagen, The cutoff limit, if it's present less than 1%, you don't have to report it. If it is a carcinogen, teratogen, or mutagen, you have to report it if it's present in a concentration greater than 0.1% by weight. So again, but if it is toxic at less than those concentrations, that's where it gets shoved over into HNOC, and you'll find that information in Section 2 of the safety data sheet. Again, kind of summarizing the tiered approach, 3 options. You can test the mixture as a whole. Second option, use bridging principles based upon your literature search, or option 3, just bring forward the component hazard information off of safety data sheets for the individual components. All right, any questions on classification? Really, again, the meat and bulk of the standard changes is right there. As a result of that classification, again, you go to appendices C and D to come up, or appendix C in this instance, to see what needs to be on the label. Underneath the old labeling system, there was only 3 data elements that were required on an old label. Under the new standard, there's 6 elements that are required. Again, the labels are a specification approach based upon what hazard category and class it's in. You go to Appendix C, and it tells you exactly what to do. OSHA is actually working on a computer program where you can enter in all your raw data into just a form, and it should go through and look at all the criteria in Appendices A and B, and then put it in a hazard class, and then based upon that, it goes out and searches and tells you, here's your pictogram, here's your other thing. That'd be a cool program if they ever get it up and running. All right, the new label requirements for your container, again, 6 elements. The first one is going to be your product identifier. That's just the name of the chemical, like WD-40, for instance. Signal word, again, that's just 1 of 2 words, either danger or warning. Okay, danger being the most severe. Your hazard statements that are brought forward by comparing your hazard class and category to the Appendices C. Your pictograms that come out of Appendices C. Your precautionary statements that come out of Appendices C. And then finally, the name, address, and phone number of the responsible party. That phone number or that contact information has to be a 24/7 manned accessibility to that information, okay? Here's the pictograms. There's only 9 pictograms total in the whole GHS system. The first one that looks like the guy with a spider on his chest, we'll call him Spider-Man. If you see a Spider-Man, that's something that's basically a long-term health effect, okay? Something that's either carcinogen, teratogen, attacks your liver over time. So examples of those chemicals, lungs over time, example of those chemicals might be like asbestos, lead, all those types of long-term toxic type of thing. The second pictogram is your flammable one. That's, of course, your flammable liquids, your pyrophoric, self-reactives, all the things that can blow up or ignite basically is under the flam. The exclamation point, I call that the Scooby-Doo mark. Doesn't that look like, woo? But anyway, that's less severe types of health effects. Okay, that's things like simple skin irritation or skin sensitizer, irritants, something has minor narcotic effects, those types of things. Next pictogram is your gas cylinder. That's your compressed gases, should have that on there. Corrosion symbol is something that has severe skin corrosion and burns, eye damage, and it's corrosive to metals. Again, if it's highly corrosive, it gets the corrosive sticker. If it's just a minor irritant, for instance, that'd get the Scooby-Doo mark instead. The exploding bomb, that's your explosives, self-reactives, and organic peroxides will have that label on it. Your flame over your circle is for anything that's an oxidizer. And then the environment, that is, again, not going to be enforced by OSHA, but that is a GHS label, and EPA is doing rulemaking on that as we speak. And then finally, the good old skull and crossbones, that indicates something that's incredibly acutely toxic, okay? So a health hazard that's acutely toxic has a skull and crossbones. And that might not be highly acutely toxic, but has other health effects that go underneath the Spider-Man symbol. Okay, what if you're going through your material safety data sheets, for instance, and developing one that, from the component material safety data sheets, a couple times when you don't bring forward all of the pictograms, okay? So for instance, let's say you have go through and you have two chemicals. One of them is highly acutely toxic, right, with the skull and crossbones, and the other one might be a minor respiratory irritant, something like that, and should have Scooby-Doo mark on there. Well, the skull and crossbones trumps the Scooby-Doo mark, so you don't put your Scooby-Doo pictogram on your safety data sheet. Similarly, something that's highly corrosive and also something that's a skin irritant, the highly corrosive symbol trumps the skin irritant symbol, and you'd only report the highly corrosive. Something that's a long-term health effect trumps something that might be, let's say, a minor skin irritant or something like that. So again, the Spider-Man will trump Scooby. Likewise, if you go through and you have the signal word for two different chemicals, one might be danger, one might be warning, you always report the most severe effects, so your danger signal word would be the one that would be reported and not the warning. One of the changes or decisions OSHA made also during the rulemaking process is, if you look at the GHS Purple Book, it allows these pictograms to have in them. In the GHS book, OSHA's made the decision that they want every pictogram with a red outline, okay? What the GHS, the Purple Book, actually says is if you manufacture and that chemical is consumed within the same country, you can have a black border, but if it's shipped outside the country of origin, it should have a red border. OSHA has just said, no, we're not letting that in states or in country stuff, so we're requiring red borders all the time on a pictogram. The other thing that the GHS book allows is blank diamonds to indicate that it doesn't fall into a hazard class. In the United States, they're not allowing blank pictograms. Okay, so you might see some chemicals coming in from Europe that might have a blank pictogram. So that's what it means. It's no hazard. But it shouldn't be done in the United States. Probably had to be redone. Signal word and hazard statements. Again, you got your then the safety data sheet is your signal word. Again, you can see as we go hazard categories, from a hazard category 1 to a hazard category 2, your signal word can change within a hazard class, okay? In this instance, the signal word goes from danger to warning as you transition from category 1 to lesser hazard category 2. So again, the signal word is not always going to be the same within a hazard class. It can change based upon hazard category. Signal words, again, only two signal words, danger and warning. Danger is always the most hazardous. So again, those can change based upon hazard category. For acute toxicity, it changes as you go from categories 1 through 4. Here's an example where the hazard statements, that's out of Appendix C. Once you classify it, you get your hazard class and category. You go to Appendix C, and the hazard statement for this particular chemical, which acute, is fatal if swallowed. Don't swallow it. Hazard statements, again, they can change as you go down hazard category within a hazard class. For instance, category 1 flammable liquid says extremely flammable. Category 2 is highly flammable. Category 3 is flammable, and category 4 is combustible. Okay, so again, you can change as you go down hazard categories within a hazard class. The hazard statements can change, but again, that's all specified by Appendix C. Here's one for acute, another example for acute oral toxicity. Category 1, the hazard statement is fatal if swallowed for 1 and 2. You go to Category 3, it changes to toxic. Category 4 is harmful if swallowed. And again, OSHA deleted Category 5, remember, for acute oral toxicity, but under the GHS system, the hazard statement would have been maybe harmful if swallowed. So again, no Category 5 under the U.S. HAZCOM standard. Precautionary information, you got your hazard statements, and now you have precautionary statements. Precautionary statements fall into one of 4 different categories that you see on the labels and material safety data sheets. Those 4 categories are basically prevention, response, storage, and disposal precautionary statements. Here's some example of some precautionary statements. Prevention type of statement might be washed thoroughly after handling as a precaution. Example of a response precautionary statement be maybe if swallowed, call poison control center. Storage example might be store locked up, and a disposal example might be disposed of in accordance with federal, state, and local regulation type of things. So again, you're going to have hazard statements and you're going to have precautionary statements. They'll both be on the labels and on the material safety data sheets. One of the things that is required by the Purple Book is precautionary pictograms, okay? In the United States, they've decided not to make these precautionary pictograms mandatory, so you don't have to put them on there. They're allowed the option to put them on there if they want, okay? So that's something that you might want to cover in your training in case employees see these blue pictograms, and might save a lot of questions about, well, what the hell is this, you know? Here's a label example. Here's a, imaginary chemical called Toxaflame. It's both toxic and flammable. Underneath the old system, basically 3 elements of data were required, and there's what your statement's going to be for your new, under the new GHS system. You can see that the label's a lot more robust. That has the pictograms on there to give you a visual representation in case you're a low literacy person, that type of thing. So labels are going to be a lot more detailed, a lot more robust than they were under the old system. Again, we've already talked about the workplace labels versus the GHS labels. It still allows you in the workplace to implement whatever in-plant labeling system you want to. So you can still use, for instance, the HMIS or the NFPA 704 system for your in-plant containers. You don't have to necessarily relabel small containers. Let's say you got a 55-gallon drum and you take a quart of it out of there. You don't necessarily have to put the quart label on or that GHS label on that quart container. You can still continue to use your NFPA 704 or HMIS for that. Here's an example of a old label for styrene monomer. This is way and above the requirements of the old HAZCOM standard. It met the 3 elements, but it had more information on there. There's what your label is going to look like under the GHS system for styrene monomer. If you come over, one of the requirements in the standard is your written programs and your safety data sheets only have to be in English. This happens to be an example where it's in several languages. But coming over here, if you take a look, if you go down, you see like H numbers. H indicates that that's a hazard statement, P precautionary statement. So we don't require to put those H and P numbers on there, just as long as the text is on there, but you can put the H and P and numbers on there. And again, that's just the H and P numbers that come out of Appendices C. Once you classify your chemical, you go to Appendices C, and there's your hazard statements and your precautionary statements. Again, a lot more visually able to understand the hazards for low literacy workers by the different pictograms that are on there. Here's just another sample label where you have all the 6 required elements on there, including your signal words and your pictograms. Here's one for ethyl alcohol. Anybody see a problem with this label? What effects does ethyl alcohol have? Anybody get up in the morning after drinking a little bit? I mean, this is one where it reports only the flammable hazards on the pictogram, right? It doesn't have anything about the narcotic effects, okay? Narcotic effects are covered under which pictogram? Anybody remember? It should have had the Scooby-Doo mark on there. Okay, updating labels. What the standard requires is, let's say, chemical manufacturer, importer, or distributor goes through and creates their label, and then they go back and new literature comes up about the toxic effect or the physical properties of a chemical. The chemical manufacturer, importer, or distributor has 6 months from the date that they discover that new information to go back and update their labels and material safety data sheets. Workplace labeling, again, we still allow your current alternate implant labeling systems. So again, you can still use the NFPA or the HMIS labels. Again, it's key during your training systems, if you guys are using HMIS or the NFPA 704, that you talk about the difference, the backwards numbering, right, in the systems. 4 is the most hazardous under NFPA 704, where 1 is the most hazardous under GHS. So again, critical piece of training information. All the requirements for labels, other requirements for labels remain unchanged. They have to be maintained, they have to be legible, they can't be defaced. I mean, no change in those provisions. Any questions on labels? All right, let's move on to safety data sheets. Again, the old standard just said prepare a safety data sheet that reports the information. No specified format, no specified content. Underneath the new system, it's the 16th section required format on the material safety data sheet. Again, sections 12 through 15 of the safety data sheet are all EPA, DOT type of information. And again, OSHA is not enforcing those sections 12 to 15. Again, the sections 12 through 15 are your ecological, disposal, transport, and regulatory information. If you take a look at the label elements, basically, if you take a look at sections 1 and 2 on the material safety data sheet, it's pretty much going to mimic the information that's on your label, okay, with a couple of extra things like HNOC, those things. You take a look at 3, 4, and 5, that's kind of your emergency response area of your safety data sheet. And then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 are kind of your safety and health hazard, what to do kind of information sections on the safety data sheet. Again, the content of each one of those sections is specified by Appendix D of the standard. 2 of the revisions, or 2 of the things that kind of hung up the standard from being developed, is we were insisting that the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists threshold limit values, the ACGI-HTLVs, be reported on safety data sheets. We battled the international community through OSHA's chairing of the International GHS Committee. It wasn't accepted on an international basis, but we did here in the United States. We do require that the ACGI-HTLVs continue to be reported on the safety data sheets. Likewise, information if it's an IARC or an NTP carcinogen are required to be reported in addition to any single positive study. We talked about that before. Again, all the information for the material safety data sheet, the precautionary statements, all that other stuff that are required in sections 1 and 2 are going to come out of Appendices C of the material safety data sheet of the standard. Whoops. Let's just go on. All right, your safety data sheet sections. Your first section is basically the identification of your product, so that'd be your chemical name of it, or the name of your preparation, how to identify it, what its recommended uses are, name and address and phone number of the responsible party, and a 24-hour manned emergency phone number should be in section 1. Going on to Section 2, that should report how that hazard classification information came out, so it should tell you what hazard class and category it's in, and as well as all the signal words, precautionary hazard statements, all that kind of stuff have to be reported in Section 2. Also in Section 2 is where you describe if it's a HNOC chemical, hazards not elsewhere classified. And then also, unless you're asserting a trade, if you have a chemical in there that's present, if something's present in your mixture in greater than 1% quantity, that have to be reported, but you do your literature search and you can't find any information on that chemical, you're still required to say, okay, we've got like 2% of this chemical in there that we can't find any data on. Okay, so you have to report unknown hazardous chemicals, you have to report chemicals where the health effects or physical effects aren't known in Section 2 also. Section 3 is kind of composition and ingredients. That's where you get the chemical name, the common name, the chemical abstract services number, and any impurities or stabilizing agents that are in your mixture that contributed to your classification of your mixture. For mixtures, you do have to put the concentrations or approximate ranges of each one of the components has to be on the material safety data sheet, unless you're asserting a trade secret claim. Then you can withhold the exact composition of those ingredients. Again, would have to be made available to you guys as safety and health professional by reason of need. For all chemicals where the trade secret claim is being claimed, trade secret claim is being made, you have to put a statement in Section 3 that composition information has been withheld. Section 4, that's your first aid measures, description of your emergency types of treatment, what the signs and symptoms of exposure are, and again, if you require special type of a treatment, that has to be indicated on there also. Section 5 is where you have all your firefighting information, what the suitable types of extinguishing media have to be reported in there. If this chemical breaks down into some hazardous decomposition products, let's say you're burning some urethane foam and releasing hydrogen cyanide, that would have to be reported. And then any special protective equipment that might be needed by personnel that are engaging in firefighting. Section 6 is your accidental release information. That should tell you what emergency procedures you have to implement. For instance, you spill mercury, throw some sulfur on it or something like that. What type of PPE is required, how to clean up and contain that information in the event of a spill. Section 7 is your safe handling and storage, whether or not there's any incompatibilities, don't expose to an oxidizer, don't expose to a base, those types of special precautions, so store at a certain temperature, for instance. Section 8 is all of your exposure controls and personal protective equipment information. Section 8 is where you find the OSHA TLV and the ACGIH TLVs will be reported in Section 8. So again, that should tell you what engineering controls, what type of personal protective equipment, those types of things are needed to prevent exposures to the chemicals. Section 9 is all the physical properties, report all the data on the physical properties. Some of the interesting points there to train on might be appearance, odor threshold. For instance, isocyanates. If you smell an isocyanate, you're already 20 times the PEL. So again, odor threshold might be good, or hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten eggs, but you get olfactory fatigue. That type of information should be reported in there. Some of the other things, that's what you find your flash points, your vapor densities, your vapor pressures, all that kind of stuff that might be interested as you're doing an assessment out in the workplace, are important for emergency response types of situations. Section 10 is your stability and reactivity. If it has any hazardous reactions, if it's subject to auto-accelerating, self-accelerating chemical reactions, what incompatible materials are. Like, for instance, you have a cyanide, you don't want to get it around an acid, and any hazardous decomposition products while it's in storage. Section 11 is all your tox information. It should tell you what the route of exposure is, or, oral ingestion, percutaneous absorption. It should tell you what the route of absorption is. It should tell you what the signs and symptoms are, both delayed and immediate, both acute and chronic, what the signs and symptoms might be. And then any of the numerical estimates of toxicity, like for instance, that acute oral toxicity, remember we talked about a lethal dose 50 of 25 milligrams per kilogram body weight. All that tox data has to be reported in this section. And then finally, whether it's a carcinogen has to be reported in that particular section. Section 12, that's all the stuff we're not enforcing in terms of EPA stuff, ecotoxicity and disposal in Section 13. Section 14 is all your transportation data. Be good for you guys because it gives you the UN, the packing classes, all that kind of stuff should be in Section 14. Section 15 is other regulatory information. Let's say, for instance, this is where states can put their information in there. So let's say you have a California Rule 66 chemical. It could say this falls as a Rule 66 chemical in California. Section 16 is any other information, kind of an optional information. And then finally, it has to have the date of preparation of that material safety data sheet. Again, you might want to talk during your HAZCOM training that you tell your shipping people, always look at the material safety data sheet and flip to Section 16, make sure we got the most current copy of the safety data sheet, okay? Again, the rest of the requirements are the same as from the old standard. You have to have a safety data sheet for each hazardous chemical. And it has to be readily accessible, and we at OSHA, you guys can keep them paper, electronic, whatever. Readily accessible is defined by us as 3 minutes. Got 3 minutes to get in there and get somebody treated if they're exposed. All right, any questions on the safety data sheets? Moving on to employee information and training. Again, we have to have labels on each container, and employees have to be trained on how to use them. Again, the safety data sheets and new labeling system are going to be phased in over several years. This is the first effective date, so we're getting, again, the cart before the horse on training, and the training has to be done by December. All the training requirements or requirements of the training program remain the same as they were under the old standards. Again, the precaution about training initially, again, that new proposed directive out there, they're going to try to go after that pretty heavily. But all the rest of the information is pretty much the same required things. Trade secret, the process for all that remains the same. You guys can't get access to trade secret information. Give the local office, OSHA office, a call, and they'd be glad to try to help you. Here's the implementation table for the state, for the entire standard. Again, the completion date is the first one that's due is your employee training program by December 1st. Again, it's not until in December of 2015, a year and a half later, 2 years later, was when you're going to start seeing all the required labels and material safety data sheets in the new format. Some approach to the other standards. Again, we took a look at the other standards that had information about our definitions of flammable liquid, and again, we went back and modified a lot of those standards: welding and cutting, handling flammable liquids, spray finishing, process safety management. There were several other standards that have changed as a result of HS and the redefinition of what a flammable liquid is. Those have already been done. Your written program, same requirements as under the old standard. It just has to describe in detail how you guys are implementing, where the information, how to get access, who's responsible, all of those types of things have to be in there. Did retain the requirement that you have a master inventory list, or a list of all the chemicals that are out there. Again, I have to cover routine tasks, talk about how you guys are interfaced with contractors, or in your guys' cases, maybe a host employer site that you're working on there. And again, it has to be made available on request, all the same requirements as the old one. They'll lead you guys out there. For you guys, you need to get out there and do some training on the labels, training on the safety data sheet format. Have to start maintaining the updated safety or the new safety data sheets as you get them. Bear in mind, one of the other things in that proposed enforcement directive was the OSHA guys are going to go out there and ask you what you did with your MSDSs once you retired them out of service. Be reminded that a material safety data sheet is defined as an employee exposure record under 1910-1020, and that has to be maintained for at least 30 years. So if you take a material safety data sheet, you get a new SDS, you got to take that MSDS, write the out of service date, file it away for 30 years somewhere. Manufacturers, none of you guys really should fall under that category. It's going to be the hardest startup for them is getting out there and do all the reclassification, relabeling, new safety data sheets and all that. So some guidance materials. We've got some OSHA's got some quick cards, fact sheets. There's a small entity compliance guideline. It's all on the OSHA home webpage for hazard communication. They're talking about putting out a model training program. They're working on that computer program to actually automate the going through the appendices C and A, B, and C and generating everything if you put in your raw data, your physical information out there. There's a link to the OSHA webpage. Impact on RCRA, again, under scope of application, the hazardous waste, if you guys are generating any of that, they don't fall under the purview of the hazard communication standards, so you still follow the EPA regulations on your hazardous wastes. Effect on you guys, again, I think hopefully today you've become a little bit familiar with the new systems. You need to start collecting new safety data sheets and take a look at your labeling systems as they come in. One thing, a lot of manufacturers and the folks I work with in general industry establishments are starting to get new SDSs and new materials with the new labels on it. I'd suggest that you guys at least do some initial awareness training, at least 5-minute awareness training, and maybe show them the pictograms. A lot of employees seem to get upset when they see these new pictograms that they don't understand. So I suggest laminating those pictograms and having a 5-minute toolbox safety talk, maybe laminating a copy and putting it up there for their reference or something like that to avoid that problem. Here's a couple links to the United Nations website for GHS. There's the OSHA website. The EPA and the DOT websites are there. I mentioned earlier that the news that came through the wire this morning is that we were working real heavily with Canada and their WISER system to make it exactly the same as OSHA's hazard communication standard, and the news that we got yesterday is that we've succeeded at that. So again, Canada should be exactly the same. There's a delegation, OSHA delegation down in Mexico also trying to do the same thing so that all of North America would be consistent, the same system. That's the major bulk of the chemicals we trade are just North America. If you want to look at the detailed changes a little bit more out on the OSHA website, there's a detailed side-by-side rule where old text is in one column, new text is in the other, the red lines in the old column, and additions in red in the new column, so you guys can really explore that. There's a link to the actual Federal Register where we publish the final rule. Again, that Federal Register contains the preamble to the standards, so if you don't understand a section of it, great place to start is going to that Federal Register and looking at the preamble and saying, okay, what the hell did they really mean by the language in that? We don't have the directive out, or OSHA doesn't have the directive out currently, so what they're doing is they get questions from the public about the new standard. They're actually updating it, or out on the website they have a Q&A on the new standard. So as they're writing letters of interpretation or answering phone call questions to clarify the standard, they're being captured in that new Q&A. So if you have a question, I'd go probably to that Q&A first. Can't find it there, go to the preamble, and you should be able to do it. That Q&A is being updated every 2 weeks by OSHA, so you got to kind of keep checking back on that Q&A to get the latest materials and questions. OSHA just published a bunch of new publications out there. I don't know which ones you guys want to see. Here's, for example, whoops, Oh, well, damn it. Oh, well. I had those hyperlinked. Anyway, there's some new publications. One on pictograms, one on labels, one on safety data sheets, a brief that describes a little bit more in detail the pictograms and labels. And then there's a whole separate publication on the training requirements, kind of some good overview. These would be great tools for you guys as you're going through and developing your training sessions out. So I really suggest you do that. Is there any questions, comments, concerns? Anything you ever wanted to know about GAHS we're afraid to ask? Anything you want to know about OSHA and I can tell you the truth about now? The other things that...
Sunset date on the MSDS is 2015.
Yes. Yeah. Part of it's mid-2015 and then the other part's the end of 2015. So, yeah, it's going to be a year and a half to 2 years before you're required to see the information that you're going to be training on in December, which I get, it's good and bad. I got mixed emotions about both of them, So go ahead.
Do you think OSHA's going to send out compliance people to come December 1st, or the day after, checking everybody?
I don't know what the devil's going to do. I don't know how to answer that. Typically we really haven't take a look at cranes and derricks. We never really started a emphasis program after that standard came out. I know initially back in '83 we did that. I was part of I hate to date myself, but I was part of the team that went out there initially in '83 when the standard came into effect and was out there going through facilities on an emphasis program. Interesting story there. I was sent to one place that manufactures cluster bombs. Okay, so I walk in the facility and they manufacture cluster bombs, and there's no guidance on the standard, and I'm giving these guys a bunch of guff about their cluster bomb boxes have to be labeled, and that got beat down pretty quickly. Anyway, good questions. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Yeah, I can. I'll leave a copy of the presentation, or I've got some cards up here. If you guys want to email me, I'd be glad to send it to you. One of the other things that's also attached here, and we won't go through it line by line, but I did put together some information on perhaps something that you guys could use as an employee training program. It's got the precedents and pictograms, all that kind of stuff is in here. So again, if you guys are looking for some training information, want a little bit more in-depth type of thing. One of the good things about it is, goes through a lot of the physical hazards and really explains what they are: flammable aerosols, gases under pressure, all that kind of stuff. So, again, feel free to use this, share it, modify it, whatever you guys want to do. I'll be glad to leave it with you guys at the association maybe. And if anybody's got a flash drive on them right now, I'd be glad to just give you a copy right now if you wanted to. All right, like I said, email me. Here's my new email address and phone number and stuff. If you guys need a copy of it, just email me and I'd be glad to make it available to you. Okay, any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, still the headphones aren't working. You guys need to get new headphones. All right, I guess I got to sign these. Take me a minute to sign these, and I guess you can come up and get your copy here. If anybody does have a thumb drive, like I said, feel free to make a.
So I already got. I got someone already in there.